Hello and welcome to this presentation on the Windsor Link Railway for Windsor residents. The Windsor Link Railway is a for-profit company which, if successful, will be the first private promoted railway for over 100 years. But it's not just about profit. The aims of the scheme are to bring social and economic benefit to Windsor as well as the surrounding region. I'm George Bathurst and the main promoter of the scheme. I started my career as a scientist working for the Admiralty Research Agency and going to sea with the Navy for submarine sonar trials. I moved to Hewlett-Packard about 15 years ago, but couldn't face living in Bracknell, so came to Windsor. Today my main job is providing webcams for day nurseries so that parents can see their children when they're at work, and we also provide the only fingerprint readers manufactured in the UK. I'm also a Windsor councillor, and one of my motivations for becoming a councillor was that I was told I couldn't get elected if I proposed radical schemes to improve the town. Even though I am now a councillor, I'm still doing this project in a private capacity because I believe that this is the best way for taxpayers. Now, on to trains. I'd like to start by addressing some of the misconceptions about the train services in Windsor. The first is that they're great in Windsor because we've got 2 stations, and surely that is better than having 1. Right? Wrong. It's not the number of stations you have that's important, but the services they provide. As this analysis shows, Windsor currently has the worst train services of any of the surrounding towns. Ascot, Slough, Staines, Bracknell, Maidenhead, Wokingham all have more routes, more trains per hour and more seats. Even though Windsor is not the biggest town, its services are still inferior to smaller towns such as Ascot. This goes some way to explaining why Windsor has such terrible traffic problems, which I'll return to later. Another thing that's often said is that Crossrail is coming and that will be transformational. Well, it will be a bit better for Windsor, but not much. As you can see from this table, the current average journey time from Windsor to London Paddington is 51 minutes. With Crossrail, that will reduce by 5 minutes and be about 20% less variable. Variability is the difference between the fastest and the slowest services, something which anybody who commutes back from Paddington in the evening will testify to the poor experience of waiting ages for the next train at Paddington or waiting whilst at Slough. Of course, if your destination isn't Paddington but Bond Street or anywhere on the new Crossrail route in central London, then your journey will be much quicker, but the benefit is in practice only felt once you're in London. So yes, Crossrail will make things a bit better for Windsor, but it won't be transformational. It's really a project for London. Another project you may have heard about is ROTH. This stands for Western Rail Access to Heathrow. Won't this make a difference to Windsor? Well, again, not really. As you can see from this table, currently the average journey time by car to Heathrow Terminal 5 is 25 minutes. Of course, it's not practical to go by train at all at the moment, and the bus takes an average of 64 minutes and sometimes more than an hour and a half. If ROTH is built, the car will still be the fastest and most reliable way to get to Heathrow from Windsor. Business travellers are less cost sensitive, so will continue to use the car, but people on holiday will usually go in groups, and for 2 or more people it will still be cheaper to go by car. So unfortunately again, ROTH will not help Windsor residents. As an aside, it's worth noticing that ROTH probably won't be much better for Slough or Maidenhead either. It will still be quicker and more reliable by car, as well as cheaper if you share. And of course, the ROTH scheme does nothing for places south of Heathrow, such as Ascot. Another thing that residents say is that Windsor may not be perfect, but we like it as it is. Let's just do nothing. Well, unfortunately, with the world changing around us, doing nothing does not result in nothing changing. And what are the consequences then of doing nothing? Firstly, it's worth noting that train services to Windsor are dramatically worse than they were 20 years ago. For example, you used to be able to get many trains from Windsor to Waterloo taking just 40 minutes. Today, you are lucky if you can get a train taking less than an hour. Paddington also used to have direct services to Windsor. The downgrades to service have been gradual but continuous, and it's likely that this trend will continue if we continue to do nothing, and I'll explain why. The line to Waterloo is currently at capacity. There is more demand than Network Rail can meet, and there is therefore competition for slots or train paths. Other towns desire those slots, and if we are not careful, we might lose out to one of them the next time the franchise is reconsidered. For example, BAA's AirTrack proposal for linking the airport to the southwest included taking the slots currently serving Windsor and redirecting them to Heathrow. This would have meant that Windsor would lose its direct services to Waterloo. Although BAA abandoned its plans for AirTrack, these have now been resuscitated by the Airports Commission, and so this threat is still live. On the other side, we have Slough Council. They recently proposed closing the train service to Windsor and replacing it with a tram. This would mean even worse services and less prospect of direct services being restored to Paddington or elsewhere. Basically, other people are after our infrastructure, and if we don't act to defend it, we could find ourselves losing out, and in a dramatically worse position if we do nothing. And it's not just rail services that will decline if we do nothing. We have big problems on the roads too. The population in this region has increased enormously in recent decades. Slough is several times larger than it used to be, but also better hidden behind trees. Ascot has grown too. Windsor is between the two, and so it's no surprise that we have terrible traffic problems with roads that are mostly no better than when the region was rural. In fact, the summer before last, the traffic jams were so bad that they threatened the viability of Windsor's commercial centre. On Saturdays, the busiest shopping day of the week, people simply could not get into town because of gridlock on the road to Ascot. Since then, Legoland has worked hard with the local council, and traffic routing trials have been successful in addressing the worst problems. However, this is not a long-term solution, all the fault of Legoland. The underlying population is increasing, and so therefore also will traffic. There is already a desperate short of parking and road space in and around Windsor. The town is cut off by the river to the north, the Great Park to the south, and the Green Belt to the west, so the opportunities for building new roads are limited and politically very difficult, even without the geographical challenges. Parking is a similar problem. Many schemes have been proposed over previous decades, but for various reasons have proved politically undeliverable. Despite this, car usage as a proportion of total visitors has risen sharply in recent years, a trend that is clearly unsustainable. Another problem for Windsor is that it lacks employment sites, and so most residents must commute elsewhere for work. This puts even more pressure on transport infrastructure, but it also threatens the viability of many shops in the town centre, which rely on office workers for weekday trade. So why haven't these things been addressed already? It appears that Windsor hasn't been shouting loud enough. Other places have been better at lobbying for themselves. From the outside, Windsor is regarded as a national treasure, and therefore nobody wants to touch it. Also, its relative success, especially compared with Maidenhead and Slough, has meant that its needs have been somewhat neglected. Heathrow was never far from the headlines, taking up a disproportionate amount of politicians' time. The less glamorous daily grind of commuters, far more important to many Windsors residents, gets less attention. However, one additional reason these problems have not been successfully addressed is that they have been approached piecemeal. Sensible suggestions for car parking in Armour Road, for example, have been very unpopular politically because they made traffic or the visual environment worse for residents. AirTrack's failure was another example of this piecemeal approach. It failed because it was a scheme by Heathrow for Heathrow. It made things worse for people in places like Ascot and Staines. What is needed is a solution that makes things better for everybody. We need an overarching plan. The WLR proposal is to take a holistic approach. That is, rather than considering transport problems in isolation, we should design a transport solution that maximises the benefit for residents and stakeholders. This map shows the existing rail network around Windsor and Heathrow. The black line at the top is the Great Western Main Line. You can also see the line from Waterloo to Windsor coming in from the right. You can also see that the map is a bit scrappy, with lots of branch lines not really going anywhere. You have the branch to Heathrow Terminal 5 on the right. You have the remains of the West Drayton Sustains line, the bottom half of which was lost when they built the M25. You have two branch lines to Windsor. You can see the proposed rail schemes I mentioned previously. Roth is the dotted blue line linking Heathrow to the northwest. The grey dotted line is the AirTrack proposal. Both of these are estimated to cost £500 million each. Now, AirTrack was the right answer if the question was how to get from Heathrow to South London. It wasn't, it turned out, the right answer for people living along the route. Roth, in my view, is repeating this mistake. If the problem is only how to get from Reading to the west and the west to Heathrow, then it is probably the right solution. But if the problem is also how do you get people from local towns to Heathrow and to each other, then clearly it isn't the solution. WLR's approach is to connect up the small missing links that exist in the current network. This is much cheaper than building whole new lines. This has the happy consequence of making many more journeys possible, but instead of being prohibitively expensive, as railways usually are, it results in much better returns on investments because we're mostly just making better use of existing assets. As you can see in red, our first proposal is to link the lines in Windsor. Then we can link the branches nearer to Heathrow to provide the same solution for connecting Heathrow to the west, but at half the price. We've marked these as Phase 1 and Phase 2 for political reasons. WLR has been told that Phase 1 is in line with government policy and the rail industry supports it. Whilst the argument for Phase 2 might be even stronger, Heathrow is more politically charged, and I have to say that we have received much less positive reception. So that is why we will focus on Phase 1 to start with. So how does this more joined up geographical map translate into train services? Here you see the current route marked in red from Waterloo to Windsor. Under WLR's proposal, this would extend on to Slough. It would also stop at a new station in Charlevy, and this would provide a park and ride, which would be much more convenient than a bus-based park and ride, where the buses get stuck in the same traffic jam as the cars. I've also shown on this map how Phase 2 would connect to Slough, Windsor and Guildford via Ascot, to Heathrow and even perhaps to HS2. It's worth noticing that HS2 will reduce journey times from London to Birmingham, but it will still be faster to Birmingham by car from Windsor. However, WLR would enable Berkshire residents to benefit from HS2 as well. Talking about the future, perhaps a better name for the Windsor Link Railway would be the Missing Link Railway. It turns out that Windsor is far from the only place where small missing bits of railway frustrate journeys. Restoring or building these anew would make the rail network much less London-centric and enable something akin to an M25 railway. But can we build it? It's all very well having a vision for the future, but can we physically build the first link in Windsor? This is an aerial photograph of Windsor. You can see the castle at the top left and the rail line from Slough on the right. This turns through 90 degrees and then goes up the viaduct to the central station. On the left you can see the line from Waterloo coming into Riverside Station. Clearly joining up these two lines presents challenges. Trains are limited by what they can do in terms of curves and gradients, the vertical and horizontal geometry. You've got to comply with safety design standards. A lot of it's a conservation zone, a super sensitive location around the castle. There are listed structures everywhere and the two train stations. There are environmental aspects to consider, such as being right next to the river, which floods. And there are more than you can see in this photograph. There's utilities and perhaps even important archaeology. And even if all these issues are addressed, we can't simply close the town whilst the railway is being built. We need to keep local businesses and residents going in the meantime. This slide shows an option for the horizontal alignment. You can see the line from Slough at the top right. This comes into a ramp going down, shown in brown, and then a ramp under the viaduct, shown in green. The station box is shown in yellow. This is 250 metres long, which is long enough even for the longest modern trains. There's also some flexibility over where exactly this goes to maximise the benefits for Windsor. There would be a new single station somewhere around the platform area. This could be where the existing tennis courts are in the Goswells, which would work well for maintaining existing shopping footfall patterns. An alternative location for the station could be by the existing coach park. The line then goes into a tunnel shown in blue. At the other side it comes up again by the Riverside Station and rejoins the existing line to Waterloo at the top right on this plan. The beauty about this alignment is that it doesn't touch any listed buildings. It also preserves our green spaces and it's away from almost all the residential areas. Regarding the tunnel section, we originally thought that the only option for this would be cut and cover. However, last year our friend Sir Robert McAlpine also suggested boring it, which they felt would be a better solution. This has the disadvantage of being more expensive. The board cost will be about 125 million versus 75 for cut and cover. However, it would cause less disruption and be below any potential archaeological remains. It would also allow wider trains. WLR doesn't mind which solution is used and is happy to make the decision in partnership with the rail operators and local people. The important point at this stage is that we have not one but two viable solutions. People interested in trains always ask about the rail gradients. This is because attempting to connect the two lines has always been defeated by this in the past. The two stations are close together horizontally but far apart vertically, meaning you'd almost need a funicular railway to connect them. The breakthrough for WLR was to realise that it's not the stations that need connecting, but the lines. Once you realise this, the curve and gradients work. These drawings show the line coming from Slough at the top left. It then goes downhill through the viaduct to the station area. This leads on to the tunnel and then the ramp back up again towards Waterloo. As you can see, all the gradients are well within the operating parameters of modern trains and even old ones. So, having looked at the physical and other constraints, McAlpine said, "Our conclusion is that we have a high level of confidence that the Windsor Link Railway project is technically deliverable." But even if we can build it, does it add up? We've established that it's technically possible, but would we want to? Well, to help answer such a question, the Department for Transport has something called the benefit to cost ratio, which it itself uses to judge whether a scheme is worth pursuing. That is, the pounds we get back as a society for every pound invested. WLR has worked with Network Rail and private sector consultants to estimate that the demand for this new rail link would generate positive returns. The result of this has been encouraging, as it found that we expect the BCR to be greater than 2. That is, for every pound invested, at least £2 will be returned. It is worth emphasising that it is only high level at this stage and a lot more work needs to be done before this conclusion could be considered robust. However, it is possible or even likely that the returns may be significantly greater. But already, as a result of this work, we have enough to believe that the railway is likely to be viable and high value for money. It's all very well ticking Whitehall's boxes and satisfying our friends at the department, but what does this actually mean for Windsor residents? Well, here are some of the examples of practical improvements that Windsor residents can expect. 10 minutes off the journey time to Paddington, 12 minutes off the time to Waterloo. Many other journeys will be practical for the first time in decades. For example, Ascot to Windsor currently takes over an hour by train, and this will be at least halved, meaning that shoppers from Ascot will have a realistic alternative when there are bad traffic jams. Also, if you take the projected increases in rail use, you can estimate the number of car journeys that will be saved, which comes out at about 7,000 per day. This figure should be taken with a large pinch of salt, as it is difficult to predict, but it is clear there will be significantly reduced pressure on Windsor's roads. In this last bullet, rising house prices are not to everybody's benefit, especially if you are still trying to buy one. However, price does give us a useful measure of how people value the improvements in quality of life that residents will experience as a result of the new train line, and £13,000 to £25,000 is a significant increase on an average property of about £500,000 in Windsor. Now, we've established that the railway is physically possible, that it pays for itself, and that it brings benefits for residents. That means it doesn't strictly require any property development. We've also shown that the alignment doesn't damage any listed buildings or green spaces such as Alexandra Gardens or the Home Park. However, you don't build railways every day, so whilst we're at it, is there anything else we should be doing? Well, have a look at this picture of the current viaduct. It doesn't look great, does it? Most of the arches are in fact unlet despite Network Rail's best efforts. But even if they were let, is this really the best we can do with this area? It's right by the park and just yards from the river, a beautiful natural resource. In fact, the whole of the Windsor Riverside area isn't as attractive as it might be. It is dominated by traffic and parking, which isn't attractive. Perhaps we can use the opportunity of the railway being built to make additional improvements to the town. This slide shows the property ownership in the Riverside area. Network Rail owned land is shown in pink. Green denotes council owned car park and council operated Goswells. Council car parks are shown in orange and third-party ownership is in blue. Now the default for property development is that each landowner does his own thing. Sooner or later, one or more of these landowners will come forward with proposals to build on their land. This is inevitable. WLR's response is not to try to stop the inevitable, but to ask the question, what would we like the riverside to look like if we could? How would we design it, not just for the benefit of developers, but also for the benefit of Windsor people? So in effect, we ignore land ownership and seek to design a scheme simply on the basis of what works best. We tear up this map. So what could we do in place of what we currently have at the moment? This, by the way, is a postcard of Alexandra Gardens just after it was built in 1902. You can see that it was a beautiful area. It was open and peaceful. If you stood in the middle of the park, you would be able to see not only the river, but also have great views of the castle. Those of you who have walked around the area today will know that, whilst it is still pleasant, it is not as nice as this. So what ideas do we have for improvement? Well, we could pedestrianise Barry Avenue, which is the road that currently cuts the park off from the river. Also, Barry Avenue is higher today and forms a flood defence. This also cuts the park off from the river. Raising the park up to the same height as the flood defence would restore the riverside nature of the park. If you were to raise the park, this would create the opportunity to put parking underneath, much more cheaply than is usual underground parking. 1,600 spaces would go a long way towards solving Windsor's parking crisis. It also creates a further opportunity to do something more attractive with all the other riverside car parks that currently spoil the riverside area of Windsor. We could also look at the area behind the gardens. Is this really the best place to have a coach park? Could we put that underground too, or the other side of the viaduct? Also, with the park opened up and reconnected with the river, it will be significantly larger than it is today. It might be complemented by a row of St Georgian style terraces behind, much like the designers of Regent's Park did in London. Several hundred new homes could potentially be provided in this way, which in turn would take pressure off the greenbelt surrounding Windsor. It would also be much more sustainable than the current population growth, which is coming mostly from subdividing existing properties. This is because it will be combined with additional parking and better rail services. What do residents think about all this? WLR surveyed 3,000 properties in central Windsor with an excellent response rate. It showed that 95% of residents thought the proposals were important to Windsor and 92% were even prepared to put their name to a petition urging the council to do more. WLR also asked quite a racy question about premium riverside homes and was surprised by the result. 75% of residents supported this in principle. Of course, this is dependent on how many and the style. There was also a survey done by the former Central Windsor Neighbourhood Plan. This found that even with, in WLR's view, quite a leading question against it, 60% of residents were still in favour. Even ignoring question bias, this answer is still consistent with the WLR survey as it had a 17% margin of error at 99% confidence. In summary, the proposals seem well supported by local people. Of course, this can change, but it's a good start. Now, even if local people like it, is it funded? By this I mean, can the private sector fund it rather than being dependent on council taxpayers? We talked earlier about the passing Department for Transport's test being high value for money. The cut-off for passing is a BCR of 1.5 and WLR is expected to exceed 2. The railway therefore is likely to provide a strong, reliable cash flow which will be attractive to a long-term investor such as a pension fund. On top of the railway there is also the property development opportunity. Again, this is likely to give in excess of the usual 20% return that property developers need. The most difficult area of funding is the initial planning permission. This is likely to cost £1 for the outline planning permission and up to £10 million for a Transport and Works Act application to the Secretary of State for Transport. Both will have to be funded as equity as it is risk money. However, for those that do invest, it is likely to provide a good return with an IRR, an internal rate of return, in excess of 25%. So yes, it is fundable. So what is the likely timetable for delivery of the project? WLR is currently at the stage of selecting an investment partner which should be completed by the beginning of next year. Over the course of next year, WLR will be working with the Council to clarify the supporting policies that would be necessary to take the scheme forward. This will be done as part of the normal process for the Borough Local Plan and in consultation with the neighbourhood plans. In 2016, planning permission based on the above policies would be sought. This will be for the above groundworks, that is, the new station and any associated property development, car parking and restoring Alexandra Gardens. Assuming we get that, we would then seek Transport and Works Act approval from the Secretary of State. This would take about 2 years, aiming to get approval by 2018. Finally, assuming a following wind for all the above, we will be putting a spade in the ground in about 2020 with the rail link operational in about 2022. Some elements of this could potentially be delivered sooner. For example, with the urgent need for parking, we could start work on that as soon as planning permission is granted in 2016. Thank you for listening. To finish, WLR say that feedback is very welcome. Many of the ideas in this presentation are not fully formed. This means that it is still open to residents to criticise, to suggest improvements or alternatives, particularly on the development and restoration of the riverside area. What is it that you want? As I said at the beginning, WLR is a for-profit company, but it is not just about profit. It aims to improve the economic and social well-being of the town. It is a community rather than developer-led project. If you want to learn more or to feedback, please go to www.windsorlink.co.uk. You can comment on the blog or get in touch directly. Thank you again.